The Waste Land is a long poem by T.S. Eliot. It is widely regarded as one of the most important poems of the 20th century and a central text in modernist poetry. Published in 1922, the 434-line poem first appeared in the United Kingdom in the October issue of the Criterion and in the United States in the November issue of the Dial. It was published in book form in December 1922. Among its famous phrases are, "April is the cruelest month," "I will show you fear in a handful of dust," and the mantra in the Sanskrit language, "Shanti, Shanti, Shanti." Eliot's poem loosely follows the legend of the Holy Grail and the Fisher King combined with vignettes of contemporary British society. Eliot employs many literary and cultural allusions from the Western canon, Buddhism and the Hindu Upanishads. Because of this, critics and scholars regard the poem as obscure. The poem shifts between voices of satire and prophecy, featuring abrupt and unannounced changes of speaker, location, and time, and conjuring of a vast and distant range of cultures and literatures. The poem's structure is divided into 5 sections. The first section, "The Burial of the Dead," introduces the diverse themes of disillusionment and despair. The second, "A Game of Chess," employs vignettes of several characters, alternating narrations that address those themes experientially. The Fire Sermon, the third section, offers a philosophical meditation in relation to the imagery of death and views of self-denial in juxtaposition influenced by Augustine of Hippo and Eastern religions. After a fourth section that includes a brief lyrical petition, the culminating fifth section, "What the Thunder Said," concludes with an image of judgment. Composition history. Writing. Eliot probably worked on the text that became The Waste Land for several years preceding its first publication in 1922. In a May 1921 letter to New York lawyer and patron of modernism John Quinn, Eliot read that he had a long poem in mind and partly on paper which I am wishful to finish. Richard Aldington, in his memoirs, relates that a year or so before Eliot read him the manuscript draft of The Waste Land in London, Eliot visited him in the country. While walking through a graveyard, they discussed Thomas Gray's elegy written in a country churchyard. Aldington writes, "I was surprised to find that Eliot had made something so popular," and then went on to say that if a contemporary poet, conscious of his limitations as Gray evidently was, would concentrate all his gifts on one such poem, he might achieve a similar success. Eliot, having been diagnosed with some form of nervous disorder, had been recommended rest, and applied for 3 months' leave from the bank where he was employed. The reason stated on his staff card was nervous breakdown. He and his first wife, Vivian Haywood Eliot, traveled to the coastal resort of Margate for a period of convalescence. While there, Eliot worked on the poem, and possibly showed an early version to Ezra Pound when, after a brief return to London, the Eliots traveled to Paris in November 1921 and stayed with him. Eliot was en route to Lausanne, Switzerland, for treatment by Dr. Roger Vertours, who had been recommended to him by Ottiline Morel. Vivian was to stay at a sanatorium just outside Paris. In Lausanne, Eliot produced a 19-page version of the poem. He returned from Lausanne in early January 1922. Pound then made detailed editorial comments and significant cuts to the manuscript. Eliot would later dedicate the poem to Pound. Manuscript drafts. Eliot sent the manuscript drafts of the poem to John Quinn in October 1922. They reached Quinn in New York in January 1923. Upon Quinn's death they were inherited by his sister, Julia Anderson. Years later, in the early 1950s, Mrs. Anderson's daughter, Mary Conroy, found the documents in storage. In 1958 she sold them privately to the New York Public Library. It was not until April 1968 that the existence and whereabouts of the manuscript drafts were made known to Valerie Elliott, the poet's second wife and widow. In 1971, Faber and Faber published a facsimile and transcript of the original drafts, edited and annotated by Valerie Elliott. The full poem prior to the Pound editorial changes is contained in the facsimile. Editing the drafts of the poem reveal that it originally contained almost twice as much material as the final published version. The significant cuts are in part due to Ezra Pound's suggested changes, although Eliot himself is also responsible for removing large sections. The now famous opening lines of the poem "April is the cruelest month breeding lilacs out of the dead land" did not appear until the top of the second page of the typescript. The first page of the typescript contained 54 lines in the sort of street voice that we hear again at the end of the second section. A game of chess. This page appears to have been lightly crossed out in pencil by Eliot himself, although there are several signs of similar adjustments made by Eliot and a number of significant comments by Vivian. The most significant editorial input is clearly that of Pound, who recommended many cuts to the poem. The typist home at tea time section was originally in entirely regular stanzas of iambic pentameter, with a rhyme scheme of a barb, the same form as Gray's Elegy, which was in Eliot's thoughts around this time. Pound's note against this section of the draft is verse not interesting enough as verse to warrant so much of it. In the end, the regularity of the four-line stanzas was abandoned. At the beginning of the Fire Sermon, in one version, there was a lengthy section in heroic couplets, in imitation of Alexander Pope's The Rape of the Lock. It described one Lady Fresca, as Richard Ellman describes it. Instead of making her toilet like Pope's Belinda, Fresca is going to it like Joyce's Bloom. The lines read, "Leaving the bubbling beverage to cool, Fresca slips softly to the needful stool, where the pathetic tale of Richardson eases her labor till the deed is done." Ellman notes, Pound warned Eliot that since Pope had done the couplets better and Joyce the defecation, there was no point in another round. Pound also excised some shorter poems that Eliot wanted to insert between the 5 sections. One of these, that Eliot had entitled Dirge, begins "Full fathom 5 your Blystein lies under the flatfish and the squids, Graves' disease in a dead Jew's eyes, where the crabs have eat the lids." At the request of Eliot's wife, Vivian, a line in the "A Game of Chess" section was removed from the poem, "And we shall play a game of chess, the ivory men make company between us, pressing lidless eyes and waiting for a knock upon the door." This section is apparently based on the marital life, and she may have felt these lines too revealing. However, the ivory men line may have meant something to Eliot. In 1960, 13 years after Vivian's death, he inserted the line in a copy made for sale to aid the London Library, of which he was president at the time. It fetched £2,800. Rupert Hart Davis had requested the original manuscript for the auction, but Eliot had lost it long ago. In a late December 1921 letter to Eliot to celebrate the birth of the poem, Pound wrote a bawdy poem of 48 lines titled Sage Om, in which he identified Eliot as the mother of the poem but compared himself to the midwife. The first lines are these of the poems of Eliot: "By the Uranian muse begot a man, the mother was a muse the sire. How did the printed infancies result from nuptials thus doubly difficult? If you must needs inquire, no diligent reader, that on each occasion Ezra performed the Caesarean operation." Publishing history. Before the editing had even begun, Eliot found a publisher. Horace Liveright of the New York publishing firm of Boney and Liveright was in Paris for a number of meetings with Ezra Pound. At a dinner on the 3rd of January 1922, he made offers for works by Pound, James Joyce and Eliot. Eliot was to get a royalty of 15% for a book version of the poem planned for autumn publication. To maximize his income and reach a broader audience, Eliot also sought a deal with magazines. Being the London correspondent for the Dial magazine and a college friend of its co-owner and co-editor, Schofield Thayer, the Dial was an ideal choice. Even though the Dial offered $150 for the poem, Eliot was offended that a year's work would be valued so low, especially since another contributor was found to have been given exceptional compensation for a short story. The deal with the Dial almost fell through, but with Pound's efforts eventually a deal was worked out where, in addition to the $150, Eliot would be awarded the Dial magazine's second annual prize for outstanding service to letters. The prize carried an award of $2,000. In New York in the late summer, Boney and Liveright made an agreement with the Dial allowing the magazine to be the first to publish the poem in the U.S. if they agreed to purchase 350 copies of the book at discount from Boney and Liveright. Boney and Liveright would use the publicity of the award of the Dial's prize to Eliot to increase their initial sales. The poem was first published in the UK, without the author's notes, in the first issue of the Criterion, a literary magazine started and edited by Eliot. The first appearance of the poem in the US was in the November 1922 issue of the Dial magazine. In December 1922, the poem was published in the US in book form by Boney and Liveright, the first publication to print the notes. In September 1923, the Hogarth Press, a private press run by Eliot's friends Leonard and Virginia Woolf, published the first UK book edition of The Waste Land in an edition of about 450 copies, the type hand-set by Virginia Woolf. The publication history of The Waste Land has been documented by Donald Gallup. Eliot, whose 1922 annual salary at Lloyd's Bank was £500, made approximately £630 with the Dial, Boney and Liveright and Hogarth Press publications. Title: Eliot originally considered titling the poem "Heat of the Police in Different Voices." In the version of the poem Eliot brought back from Switzerland, the first two sections of the poem, "The Burial of the Dead" and "A Game of Chess," appeared under this title. This strange phrase is taken from Charles Dickens' novel Our Mutual Friend, in which the widow Betty Higden says of her adopted foundling son Sloppy, "You mightn't think it, but Sloppy is a beautiful reader of a newspaper. He'd the police in different voices." Quote, some critics use this working title to support the theory that, while there are many different voices in the poem, there is only one central consciousness. What was lost by the rejection of this title, Eliot might have felt compelled to restore by commenting on the commonalities of his characters in his note about Tarshish, stating that what Tarshish sees, in fact, is the substance of the poem. In the end, the title Eliot chose was The Waste Land. In his first note to the poem he attributes the title to Jessie L. Weston's book on the Grail legend, From Ritual to Romance. The allusion is to the wounding of the Fisher King and the subsequent sterility of his lands, to restore the king and make his lands fertile again. The Grail quest must ask, what ails you? A poem strikingly similar in theme and language called Waste Land, written by Madison Cavine, was published in 1913 in Poetry. The poem's title is often mistakenly given as Waste Land or Wasteland, omitting the definite article. However, in a letter to Ezra Pound, Eliot politely insisted that the title was three words beginning with the structure. The poem is preceded by Latin and Greek epigraph from the Satyricon of Petronius. In English, it reads, "I saw with my own eyes the Sibyl of Cumae hanging in a jar, and when the boys said to her, 'Sibyl, what do you want?' she replied, 'I want to die.'" Following the epigraph is a dedication that reads, "For Ezra Pound il Maglia Fabbro." Here Eliot is both quoting line 117 of Canto 26 of Dante's Purgatorio, the second canticle of the Divine Comedy, where Dante defines the troubadour Nathaniel as the best smith of the mother tongue, and also Pound's title of Chapter 2 of his The Spirit of Romance, where he translated the phrase as the better craftsman. This dedication was originally written in ink by Eliot in the 1922 Boni and Amp Liverite edition of the poem presented to Pound. It was subsequently included in future editions. The 5 parts of The Waste Land are titled The Burial of the Dead, A Game of Chess, The Fire Sermon, Death by Water, What the Thunder Said. The text of the poem is followed by several pages of notes purporting to explain his metaphors, references, and allusions. Some of these notes are helpful in interpreting the poem, but some are arguably even more puzzling, and many of the most opaque passages are left unannotated. The notes were added after Eliot's publisher requested something longer to justify printing The Waste Land in a separate book. 30 years after publishing the poem with these notes, Eliot expressed his regret at having sent so many inquirers off on a wild goose chase after tarot cards and the Holy Grail. There is some question as to whether Eliot originally intended The Waste Land to be a collection of individual poems to be considered one poem, with 5 sections. The structure of the poem is also meant to loosely follow the vegetation myth and Holy Grail folklore surrounding the Fisher King story as outlined by Jessie Weston in her book From Ritual to Romance. Weston's book was so central to the structure of the poem that it was the first text that Eliot cited in his notes on The Waste Land. Style. The style of the poem is marked by the hundreds of allusions and quotations from other texts that Eliot peppered throughout the poem, in addition to the many highbrow references and/or quotes from poets like Baudelaire, Shakespeare, Ovid, and Homer. Eliot also included a couple of references to lowbrow genres. A good example of this is Eliot's quote from the 1912 popular song The Shakespearean Rag by lyricists Herman Ruby and Jean Buck. There were also a number of lowbrow references in the opening section of Eliot's original manuscript, but they were removed from the final draft after Eliot cut this original opening section. The style of the work in part grows out of Eliot's interest in exploring the possibilities of dramatic monologue. This interest dates back at least as far as the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock. The Waste Land is not a single monologue like Prufrock. Instead, it is made up of a wide variety of voices. The Waste Land is notable for its seemingly disjointed structure, indicative of the modernist style of James Joyce's Ulysses. In the modernist style, Eliot jumps from one voice or image to another without clearly delineating these shifts for the reader. He also includes phrases from multiple foreign languages, indicative of Pound's influence.